practically unscathed Roman army standing triumphant deep in Asia Minor, the truth became apparent. Rome had no equal in the Mediterranean. The terms Rome laid at the feet of Antiochus were harsh. A huge cash payment was demanded, hostages of the ruling families were taken back to Rome, and the Syrian king agreed to never again cross the Taurus Mountains, which stood between Anatolia and the mainland Middle East. This range became the de facto frontier of the rapidly expanding Roman Empire. Though Greece and Asia Minor would not be incorporated as official provinces for years, Roman rule in the region was never again in doubt. It was a Roman world, the Greeks just lived in it. The outcome of the war seems like it should have been another feather in the cap of Scipio, but instead it became the source of a great bitterness that would fill the Roman general for the rest of his life. Upon returning to Rome, the Scipione brothers were accused by Cato and his allies of misappropriating war funds. While not denying the charges, Scipio asked if anyone present was dissatisfied with the fact that Rome was making back 5 times what it had put into the war because of the indemnity forced on Antiochus by the two brothers. Anyone? Anyone? The brothers were off the hook for a while, but charges were raised again 5 years later. In a bit of poor planning by the opposition, however, the charges against Scipio were brought on the anniversary of the Battle of Zama, and public support for Scipio was at an all-time high. He was never convicted of anything, but the affair left a bad taste in the general's mouth. Retiring to an estate in Campania, he died in 183 BC. The epitaph of his tomb allegedly read, "Ungrateful fatherland, you will not even have my bones." He never did deny the charges, though. Next week, Rome will face déjà vu all over again. After the deaths of Philip V and Antiochus the Great, their sons would pick up the mantle and challenge Rome in the field. Having not yet felt the sting of defeat, the brash young kings would soon enough find themselves as beaten and demoralized as their fathers. Fighting Rome was nothing if not a death blow to the ego. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 26, The Third Macedonian War. Having soundly beaten Macedon and Syria, the last two major powers in the east, Rome was now the dominant force in the Mediterranean, a distinction it would hold for the next 700-odd years. In the years after the Syrian War, the Romans were wrapped up with Gallic revolts in the Po Valley and persistent unrest in Spain. Though these territories had been officially conquered, the Romans found it as difficult to maintain their position in these territories as it had been to establish it in the first place. But for the most part, these were mere skirmishes in the wider scope of Mediterranean politics. The real center of attention remained Greece, where, like in Spain and Gaul, winning the prize was not the same as keeping the prize. Yes, the Romans had demonstrated the superiority of that corps, but the fiercely independent Greeks would never passively stand by as a foreign power held final say over their lives. Rome had its allies, most notably the Kingdom of Pergamum in Asia Minor, but the majority of Greeks bristled at the presence of the barbarians from the west. Factions of nobles in most of the important cities schemed constantly to carve out as much autonomy as they could, with an eye on eventually throwing off the Roman yoke. Greece was, after all, the oldest and greatest civilization on Earth. Surely Roman rule was merely temporary, and in time the Greeks would retake their place as the leaders of civilization. Right? In Macedon, Philip V had been put squarely in his place, and for all his pride and ambition, he was able to do little about his sorry state after being defeated at Cynocephaly. Though he hated Rome, he was a broken man who could not muster the energy for a full-scale revolt. That task would be left to his son, who would return the bravado and swagger to Macedon and renew their quest to drive the Italians from Greece forever. The catalyst of the Third Macedonian War was Philip V's death in 179 BC, which was, by all accounts, directly related to a quarrel between his two sons, Perseus and Demetrius. After the peace between Macedon and Rome, young Demetrius, Philip's second son, had been sent to Rome as a hostage. Years spent in the city had left the young prince with a pro-Roman worldview. Perseus feared that the political leanings of his younger brother would manifest upon their father's death, that Rome would engineer a coup and Perseus would be denied his rightful throne, while Demetrius ruled a puppet kingdom for Rome. So, when Demetrius returned to Macedon in 180 BC, Perseus moved quickly against his brother, convincing Philip that Demetrius was guilty of treason and was plotting with Rome to install himself as king. Philip allowed himself to be swayed and reluctantly ordered the execution of his son. Despite his belief that he had no choice, Philip never recovered from Demetrius' death, and within a year, the old king was dead. This left Perseus in control, and Rome concerned about their eastern flank. The Macedonian king kept testing Roman patience, clearly violating the treaty his father had signed by taking control of neighboring territory outside Macedon proper and opening diplomatic relations with the Greek political syndicates. Most worrisome to Rome, Perseus arranged marriage to the daughter of Seleucus IV, who had succeeded his father Antiochus the Great as king of Syria. The Senate hoped for the best, though, and, weary of war and unwilling to embrace a belligerent stance, they turned a blind eye to Perseus' actions. The alliance between the two great Greek powers was a cause of concern in the Senate, but even more so for the kingdom of Pergamum, Rome's steadfast ally, whose territory bordered both Syria and Macedon. Envoys from Pergamum began to send dispatches detailing the outrages and offenses of Perseus, begging Rome to do something about the young upstart king of Macedon. Rome ignored the threat for as long as they could, but finally Illyria began to rise in revolt against Rome, and the common belief was that Perseus was behind the violence. That, coupled with an assassination attempt against the king of Pergamum, sealed the deal, and in 172 BC, legions were sent back across the Adriatic. At first, the Romans simply moved into Illyria to quell the uprising, and stood on the border of Macedon. But a year later, war was officially declared, and the legions headed into Macedon under the command of Licinius Crassus, an ancestor of the famous triumvir, who would join with Julius Caesar and Pompey in their fatal three-way alliance a century later. This Crassus did not get his familial legacy off to a great start, and promptly led the Romans to their first defeat in Greece. It was a minor engagement to be sure, but the propaganda value of the loss was a boon to Perseus, and Greek leaders who had kept their distance from an open conflict with Rome began to throw their support to Macedon. It was a decision that would haunt a lot of them, and lead not to freedom, but to the obliteration of freedom. After direct confrontation with the Macedonians had proved to be more difficult than the Romans thought, the next 2 years saw the Roman army in the east turn toward more profitable and less dangerous pursuits: the plunder of defenseless Greek towns. The consuls in charge during these 2 years seem to have had little ability or desire to control their men, and the legions became little more than a highly efficient band of marauders. A great deal of wealth, plunder, and slaves were hauled back to Rome. Everyone profited, so discipline went out the window. This, coupled with the behind-the-scenes maneuvering of Perseus, turned even more Greeks against Rome. There was little to be gained by standing with the Romans now. The Italian brutes had no interest in governing, or, indeed, the lives of Greeks in general. They just wanted to ransack the countryside. In 168 BC, the new consul for the year was Aemilius Paulus, the son of the Paulus who had tried to halt the Battle of Cannae before it happened, and then died leading his troops into the massacre. More disciplined than the previous consuls, Paulus the Younger immediately restored a sense of purpose to the troops, reminding them that they were there to fight as soldiers against an army, not thieve from innocent Greeks, who were, after all, nominally under Roman protection, if that was not a complete contradiction in terms by now. Paulus located the army of Perseus and announced his intention to make for the Macedonian army and defeat them. Perseus was well positioned with 40,000 troops on the Aegean coast, and dislodging him would take some doing. Paulus ordered one of his generals to take a chunk of the army and make a lot of noise approaching Perseus from the north. This maneuver convinced the Macedonians that the main Roman army would follow, and they prepared for an invasion from the north. However, as soon as darkness fell, the Roman expeditionary force kept right on walking, and swung around behind the Greeks. Only the timely intervention of a Roman deserter alerted Perseus to the danger. 12,000 Greeks were sent down to block the Romans coming up now from the south, but they were driven back in disarray. Realizing he was being encircled and unsure of where the rest of the Romans actually were, Perseus broke north out of his fortified position and set himself up in a country would ensure the proper deployment of his phalanx. Having flushed out his prey, Paulus immediately recombined his force and marched to meet Perseus. After spending the night camped across the plain from each other, the two sides rose the next morning, eager to have it out. According to legend, Paulus, facing east, stalled his deployment until the afternoon, when the sun would be in the eyes of the Macedonians. Whether this is true or not is a matter of debate, but it is true that the battle did not start until the afternoon, and despite the evenly matched sizes of the two armies, things quickly got away from Perseus. Whether or not the sun played any role is, again, a matter of debate. The Greek phalanx pushed the Romans back initially, which was good, but they pushed the Romans back onto uneven hills bordering the plain, which was bad. The phalanx began to splinter, and the Romans were able to send individual maniples through the breaks in the Macedonian line, and not so much flank the Macedonians as eat them from the inside out. The Macedonian left disintegrated, and Perseus fled with his cavalry. Of the 40,000 or so Greeks in the Macedonian army, at least 25,000 died at Pydna, while the Romans lost maybe 1,000. 5,000 Greeks were captured along with Perseus himself. Where his father had managed to negotiate a peace that left him in control of Macedon, Perseus received no such favors. The young king was paraded through Roman chains at Paulus's triumph, and then banished to exile in a small Italian village where he lived a miserable existence and died in obscurity. And he showed such promise. The defeat at Pydna marked the end of the Macedonian kingdom, whose holdings under Alexander had once extended all the way to India. The Senate broke the kingdom up into 4 republics, which were forbidden to trade directly with one another or any other Greek city. All economic activity had to be brokered by Rome. This ensured that no undue consolidation of riches or power occurred, and that the Romans would never have to deal with trouble in Macedon again. Weak and divided, the Macedonians would attempt one last-ditch effort for independence years later, but that would merely present the Romans with an opportunity to officially incorporate the territory into the province of Macedonia. Returning to Rome, Paulus, who had done so much to end the senseless pillaging of the legions, led his army on one of the great sadistic rampages of the ancient world. Passing through Epirus, the Romans, furious at the Greeks in general for turning on Rome, decided that an example had to be made of someone to prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future. They chose Epirus because it was convenient, even though the locals had nothing to do really with Perseus or his war against the Romans. At first, Paulus implied that if he was paid off, Epirus would be spared, and the 70 or so towns collected as much as they could and handed it willingly to the Romans. But the minute Paulus had collected it all, he simply let his men off their leashes and let them sack, rape, plunder, and burn anyone and anything they came across. Over 150,000 locals were bound